30 years. It's impossible to sum up 3 decades of caregiving in a few words. My life with Henry has been shaped entirely by his paralysis, a shadow that first fell over us one rainy evening all those years ago. I've cared for him through every season, through my own health scares, through every ache and pain that comes with aging. But it's just what you do, isn't it? For someone you love. That's what I've told myself every single day. Henry's accident was the kind of phone call that rearranges your life in an instant. I still remember standing in the kitchen, the smell of stew bubbling on the stove. It was late, and he was driving back from a meeting with investors for his business. The officer's voice on the other end of the line was calm but firm. "Your husband has been in a serious accident. You need to come to the hospital." The hours that followed were a blur of antiseptic smells, harsh fluorescent lights, and the sound of Henry groaning in pain. When the doctor finally sat me down, I could barely hear him through the pounding in my ears. "Spinal injury," he said. "Complete paralysis from the waist down." Henry had always been a proud man. He owned his own business, a modest but steady operation in supply chain logistics, and he prided himself on providing for us. The accident took that away from him. It took his mobility, his independence, and, over time, his spark. I stepped in where he couldn't, learning how to manage not only his care, but also the household and, eventually, the finances. I didn't resent it, not at first. I saw it as an extension of my wedding vows, in sickness and in health. But as the years passed, I began to feel the weight of it all. Henry wasn't the same man anymore. He was moody, quick to snap, and withdrawn. The warmth and humor that had defined our marriage seemed to vanish, replaced by a quiet bitterness. My days became an endless loop of caregiving. I'd wake early, start the kettle for tea, and prepare Henry's breakfast. I'd help him from bed to chair, wash and dress him, and tend to his every need. There were medications to manage, doctor's appointments to schedule, and therapy sessions to encourage. I kept the house running, paying bills, grocery shopping, and cooking. My own needs always came second, or third, or not at all. "Thank you, Elizabeth," Henry would say sometimes, his voice distant. "I don't know what I'd do without you." But his gratitude was muted, perfunctory. I often wondered if he even meant it. Over the years, friends drifted away, their invitations growing less frequent as they realized I could rarely accept. Family visits were sporadic, marked by awkward silences and forced cheerfulness. I poured everything I had into Henry's care, telling myself it was enough. It had to be enough. But there were nights, quiet, lonely nights, when I lay awake in bed and wondered what my life might have been if that car accident had never happened. I buried those thoughts quickly, ashamed of them. What kind of wife would I be if I let myself dwell on what-ifs? Then, a few weeks ago, everything changed. It was a Wednesday morning, and I was sorting through the post, a mix of bills, advertisements, and the occasional charity appeal. Among them was an envelope with no return address. My name was written on the front in unfamiliar handwriting. Thinking it might be a thank you note from one of the church groups I occasionally donated to, I opened it without a second thought. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one line scrawled across it. "He's lying to you." The words hit me like a slap. I stared at the note, my heart pounding in my chest. Who had sent it? What did it mean? Lying about what? My first instinct was to dismiss it, an obvious prank or a mistake. But as the day wore on, the note stayed with me, a whisper in the back of my mind I couldn't ignore. That evening, as I helped Henry into his wheelchair, I found myself watching him more closely than usual. Every grimace, every movement, seemed suddenly suspect. I hated myself for it, but the seed of doubt had been planted. "Is something wrong?" Henry asked, his tone brusque. "No, nothing," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just a bit tired." That night, I couldn't sleep. The letter was tucked away in my bedside drawer, but it felt as though it were burning a hole through the wood. The words repeated in my mind, over and over, "He's lying to you." I replayed memories of Henry's accident, his recovery, his years of living with paralysis. I searched for moments that didn't quite fit, for signs I had missed. But nothing came to mind. Still, the doubt wouldn't leave me. In the days that followed, I began to notice things, small, almost imperceptible details. The way Henry adjusted himself in his wheelchair when he thought I wasn't looking. The way he seemed to hesitate when I asked about his physical pain. The way he always found excuses to avoid certain doctors or medical tests. My suspicion grew slowly, like a dark cloud forming on the horizon. I told myself I was imagining things, that the stress of caregiving was getting to me. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One afternoon, as I folded laundry in the living room, I found myself staring at the wheelchair sitting empty by the window. I had a sudden, irrational urge to test it, to see if I could make sense of the doubts swirling in my mind. But before I could act, Henry called out from the bedroom, snapping me back to reality. "Elizabeth. I need you." Sighing, I set the laundry aside and went to him, my thoughts heavy with questions I didn't dare ask. That evening, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. If there was even a shred of truth to the letter, I needed to know. I couldn't continue living with this doubt, this gnawing sense that my life, my sacrifice, had been built on a lie. And so, I resolved to find the truth, no matter where it led me. The morning after I decided to seek the truth, my resolve felt fragile, like a thread stretched too thin. The note haunted me, those 4 words seemed to echo everywhere I turned. As I went about my daily routine, caring for Henry as I always did, I couldn't stop questioning every detail, every moment that hadn't quite added up. Had there always been signs? Or was I just seeing ghosts in the corners of my mind? I started small, careful not to let my unease show. The first step was revisiting the memory of the accident. Henry rarely spoke about it, and over the years, I had stopped asking. But now, I needed answers. That evening, as we sat together after dinner, I broached the subject as casually as I could manage. "Do you ever think about the accident?" I asked, keeping my tone light. Henry looked up from the newspaper he was scanning, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Why do you ask?" "I don't know," I said, shrugging. "It's just been on my mind. It all happened so fast back then. I suppose I never really understood what caused it." He set the paper down, his lips pressing into a thin line. "It was wet roads and bad luck," he said flatly. "We've been over this." His dismissive tone sent a shiver down my spine. "I know," I said quickly. "I just thought." "Let it rest, Elizabeth," he snapped, his voice sharper than usual. I flinched, the tension in the room thick enough to choke on. For years, I had tolerated Henry's temper, brushing it off as frustration with his condition. But now, his reaction struck me as defensive, almost calculated. Over the next few days, I began to dig deeper. I started with his medical records, something I hadn't looked at in years. They were stored in a box in the attic, mixed in with old bills and insurance paperwork. As I sifted through the yellowed pages, I found the report from his initial hospitalization. It was filled with technical jargon I didn't fully understand, but one line caught my eye. Patient reports minimal sensation below the waist. No conclusive evidence of permanent nerve damage at this time. I stared at the words, my heart pounding. No conclusive evidence. Had that changed over time? Or had I simply believed what Henry told me, never questioning it? The next clue came from an unlikely source, his wheelchair. One afternoon, as Henry napped, I carefully examined it, noting every detail. It was a newer model, one we'd purchased a few years ago after his old one had worn out. I remembered how insistent he had been about choosing this particular chair, claiming it was more comfortable. As I ran my hands over the armrests, my fingers brushed against the underside of the seat. There, tucked into a small compartment, was a folded piece of paper. I pulled it out, my hands trembling, and unfolded it to reveal a receipt. It was from a sporting goods store, dated 3 months ago. For a pair of running shoes. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the receipt as though it might burst into flames. Why would Henry buy running shoes? He couldn't even walk, or so I had believed for the past 30 years. The implications of that tiny piece of paper sent my thoughts spiraling. Had he been lying to me all this time? And if so, why? The questions consumed me, but I knew I couldn't confront him without more proof. I decided to watch him more closely, to look for the subtle signs I had ignored for so long. And slowly, they began to appear. One evening, as I stood outside his room, I heard a faint rustling sound. Peeking through the crack in the door, I saw him sitting on the edge of the bed, his hands gripping the mattress. His legs shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to make my stomach drop. The next morning, I noticed the way he adjusted himself in his wheelchair, lifting his weight with his arms in a motion that seemed too practiced, too effortless. And once, as I bent to pick up a dropped spoon, I caught him glancing at his feet, a flicker of something, awareness, maybe, crossing his face. Each discovery chipped away at the foundation of trust one had built my life on. By the end of the week, I felt like a stranger in my own home, surrounded by memories and routines that suddenly seemed false. I needed answers, and I needed them soon. I decided to revisit the financial records next. Henry had always managed our money, even after the accident, insisting it was his way of contributing. I had trusted him completely, never questioning where the money went or how it was spent. But now, that trust felt like a luxury I could no longer afford. That evening, after Henry had gone to bed, I sat at the dining room table with his laptop in front of me. It was password protected, but I knew him well enough to guess his credentials. After a few tries, I was in. The first thing I noticed was the series of transfers, small, recurring amounts being funneled into an account I didn't recognize. The payments were labeled as consulting fees, but the amounts seemed suspiciously inconsistent. As I dug deeper, I found more discrepancies, unexplained withdrawals, payments to unfamiliar names, and a series of emails marked urgent from a name I didn't recognize. My hands trembled as I opened one of them, my eyes scanning the words. The funds have been transferred. Let me know when you're ready to move forward. The reality of what I was uncovering hit me like a freight train. Henry wasn't just lying about his paralysis, he was hiding something far bigger. Financial trouble? Fraud? The implications were overwhelming, and I struggled to keep my composure as I pieced the clues together. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, my mind raced with questions. How long had he been planning this? What was he trying to achieve? And most importantly, what was I going to do about it? I had spent 30 years sacrificing everything for this man, my independence, my health, my happiness. Now, the cracks in our life together were widening into an abyss, threatening to swallow everything I thought I knew. But one thing was certain, I couldn't stop now. The truth was within reach, and I was determined to uncover it, no matter what it cost me. The morning after discovering the financial discrepancies, I woke with a heavy weight in my chest. My home, once a sanctuary of care and sacrifice, now felt like a house of cards. Every glance at Henry, every moment of our routine, was tainted by the question that gnawed at me, how long has he been lying? I spent the next few days gathering more evidence, combing through Henry's records in secret whenever he was occupied. The emails were the most revealing. The name Carlton appeared frequently, tied to cryptic messages about transfers, timing, and something called the exit plan. My stomach churned as I pieced the clues together. Henry had been funneling money, our money, into a hidden account, with Carlton acting as his accomplice. But why? And what was this exit plan? One evening, as I helped Henry into his wheelchair, I found myself studying his face. He looked so tired, so ordinary, as though he were the same man I had cared for all these years. But the cracks in his facade were becoming impossible to ignore. Is something bothering you? He asked, his tone sharp. I froze, my heart pounding. No, I said quickly. Why do you ask? You've been distracted lately, he said, narrowing his eyes. I can tell. I'm just tired, I lied, forcing a small smile. It's nothing. But it wasn't nothing, and we both knew it. His suspicion only fueled my determination to uncover the full truth. The next breakthrough came when I found an old notebook buried in the back of Henry's desk drawer. The pages were filled with numbers, notes, and calculations, his handwriting unmistakable. At first glance, it seemed innocuous, like the kind of ledger he might have kept for his business. But as I flipped through the pages, I noticed entries that didn't make sense, dates that didn't align with his paralysis, payments to unfamiliar names, and references to properties I didn't recognize. One entry, in particular, made my blood run cold. Meeting with C. Secure funds for Plan B must finalize by October. Plan B. My hands trembled as I stared at the words. This wasn't just about money, Henry was planning something far bigger than I had imagined. I knew I couldn't keep my investigation a secret forever. The more I uncovered, the more I realized I needed help. But who could I turn to? My friends were distant, and my family's visits were sporadic at best. Still, there was one person who came to mind, my niece, Claire. Claire was a sharp, no-nonsense woman who worked in finance. She had always been kind to me, visiting occasionally and sending thoughtful notes. If anyone could help me make sense of the tangled web Henry had spun, it was her. That weekend, I invited Claire over for tea, keeping my tone casual when I called her. She arrived with her usual warmth, a bouquet of flowers in hand. "It's good to see you, Aunt Lizzie," she said, hugging me tightly. "You sounded a bit off on the phone. Is everything okay?" I hesitated, unsure of how to begin. "There's something I need to show you," I said finally. "Something I need your help with." I led her to the dining table, where I had laid out the evidence, the emails, the financial records, the receipt for the running shoes. As she examined the documents, her expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "This is serious," she said, her voice low. "Henry's hiding something big. These transfers, they're not small amounts, Aunt Lizzie. He's been moving significant sums." I nodded, my throat tightening. "Do you think he's capable of lying about everything? Even his paralysis?" Claire hesitated, then looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and resolve. "I think you need to prepare yourself for the possibility," she said gently. "If this Plan B is what I think it is, he's been deceiving you for years." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had known, deep down, that this was the likely truth. But hearing it from someone else made it feel real in a way I wasn't ready for. Over the next few days, Claire helped me dig deeper into Henry's finances. Together, we traced the transfers to an offshore account in his name, controlled by someone listed only as C. Carlton. The account had been steadily growing over the past decade, fueled by withdrawals from our savings, investments, and even my pension. "He's bleeding you dry," Claire said, her voice tinged with anger. "And this exit plan? I don't think it's just about money. He's setting himself up to disappear." The realization left me reeling. For 30 years, I had dedicated my life to caring for Henry, sacrificing my own happiness and well-being to ensure his comfort. And now, it seemed, he had been planning to leave me all along. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a wave of emotions crash over me: anger, betrayal, grief. But beneath it all, there was a flicker of something else: resolve. I wasn't the naive, self-sacrificing woman I had been for so long. If Henry thought he could manipulate me, he was wrong. I began to plan my next move. Confronting Henry directly felt too risky. I didn't yet have all the answers, and I didn't trust myself to keep my emotions in check. Instead, I decided to set a trap. With Claire's help, I drafted an email posing as Carlton, using a dummy account to request a meeting. The message was simple but direct: "We need to discuss the timeline. Can you meet Tuesday at 3 p.m? When I sent it, my hands trembled. It felt like crossing a line I could never return from. But if Henry responded, it would be the proof I needed. The following day, I checked the dummy account obsessively, my nerves stretched taut. By late afternoon, a reply appeared. "Tuesday works. Usual spot." I stared at the screen, my heart racing. The confirmation was both a relief and a dagger to the chest. Henry had taken the bait. As Tuesday approached, I knew the moment of truth was near. I would follow him, watch where he went, and confront him with the evidence I had gathered. But the thought of seeing him outside the house, walking, moving freely, filled me with a mix of dread and anticipation. For 30 years, I had lived in the shadow of his paralysis. Now, I was about to step into the light of the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Tuesday arrived like a storm cloud on the horizon. Every passing hour felt heavier, each minute more charged with the weight of what I was about to uncover. I went through my morning routine as if it were any other day, making breakfast for Henry, helping him into his chair, and setting him up with his newspaper. But beneath the veneer of normalcy, my mind raced with anticipation. Today, I would find out the truth. Claire had insisted on accompanying me to follow Henry to his meeting. "You shouldn't do this alone," she said firmly. I was grateful for her support, though the idea of involving anyone else in my private turmoil left me uneasy. Still, as we sat in Claire's car across the street from the house, watching and waiting, I realized I couldn't have done this without her. At 2:45 p.m., the front door opened. My breath caught in my throat as I watched Henry wheel himself down the ramp I had built for him all those years ago. He paused at the bottom, glancing around as though checking for onlookers. Then, with a suddenness that made my heart stop, he stood. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. There he was, standing, walking, moving with the ease of someone who had never been confined to a wheelchair. I clutched Claire's arm, my nails digging into her sleeve as we watched him stride to the car, open the driver's door, and slide in. "I don't believe it," Claire whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. "He's been faking it this whole time." I couldn't speak. My throat felt tight, my chest heavy. Everything I had sacrificed, every moment of my life I had devoted to his care, it all felt like a cruel joke. We followed him at a distance, Claire keeping the car far enough back to avoid suspicion. Henry drove with practiced confidence, turning down streets I didn't recognize. After about 20 minutes, he pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe on the outskirts of town. "Do you recognize this place?" Claire asked. I shook my head. "No. He's never mentioned it." We parked across the street, watching as Henry entered the cafe. Moments later, a man joined him at a corner table. I couldn't make out their faces clearly from the car, but the way they leaned in close, speaking in low tones, made my stomach churn. "That must be Carlton," Claire said. For the next hour, we waited, the tension in the car thick enough to cut with a knife. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more damning than the last. Was this Carlton the mastermind behind Henry's schemes? Or was he simply a pawn in whatever web Henry had spun? When Henry finally left the cafe, he was alone. Claire and I exchanged a glance, silent agreement passing between us as we started the car and followed him home. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with the evidence I had gathered spread out before me. The emails, the financial records, the receipt for the running shoes, all of it painted a damning picture. But the image of Henry walking into that cafe was the final nail in the coffin. There was no denying it now, he had been lying to me for 30 years. The thought filled me with equal parts rage and heartbreak. How could he do this to me? To us? Every moment of my life had been shaped by his supposed condition, every decision colored by his needs. And now, it was all a lie. The next morning, I confronted him. "Henry," I said as I entered the living room, my voice steadier than I expected. "We need to talk." He looked up from his newspaper, his expression wary. "What is it?" I held up the receipt for the running shoes, my hand trembling slightly. "Care to explain this?" His face froze, the color draining from his cheeks. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice sharp. "I found it in your wheelchair," I said evenly. "Along with the emails. And the bank statements. Oh, and let's not forget the fact that I watched you walk into a cafe yesterday." For a moment, he said nothing, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for words. Then, finally, he sighed, sinking back into the chair. "I can explain," he said, his tone defensive. "Please do," I said, crossing my arms. "Because I'd love to know why you've been lying to me for 3 decades. He hesitated, his gaze flickering between me and the floor. "It wasn't supposed to go on this long," he said finally. "At first, I thought it would be temporary. A way to buy some time." "Time for what?" I demanded, my voice rising. "What were you planning, Henry?" He sighed again, rubbing a hand over his face. "I was in trouble, Elizabeth. Financial trouble. The business was failing, and I needed a way to reset things. The accident gave me an opportunity." My stomach turned. "So you faked your paralysis? You let me believe you were helpless, let me sacrifice my life for you, all to cover up your mistakes?" "I didn't have a choice," he snapped, his voice harsh. "Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I wanted to live like this?" "You didn't live like this," I said coldly. "I did." The weight of my words seemed to hit him, and for a moment, he looked genuinely remorseful. But the anger bubbling inside me refused to be quelled. "What was your plan, Henry?" I pressed. "The exit plan you mentioned in your emails. Were you going to take the money and disappear? Leave me here with nothing after everything I've done for you?" He didn't answer, his silence more damning than any confession. That evening, I called Claire. "It's time," I said simply. "The family needs to know." We arranged a gathering at the house for the following weekend, inviting the few relatives who still visited us occasionally. As I prepared for the confrontation, I felt a strange mix of fear and determination. This was my chance to reclaim my life, to expose the truth and finally free myself from the prison Henry had built around me. The day of the family gathering arrived with a nervous energy that thrummed in my chest like a beating drum. I had spent the week preparing, both emotionally and practically, for what I knew would be one of the hardest moments of my life. Confronting Henry in front of the family wasn't just about exposing the truth, it was about reclaiming my dignity, my autonomy, and the 30 years of my life I'd spent caring for a man who had deceived me. Claire arrived early, offering her support as we set up for the gathering. She could sense my tension, her reassuring presence a balm against the storm raging inside me. "You're doing the right thing," she said softly as we arranged the tea and snacks. "You deserve to have the truth out in the open." I nodded, though my hands trembled as I placed a plate of biscuits on the table. "What if they don't believe me?" I asked. "They will," she said firmly. "And if they don't, we have the proof." Her words steadied me, if only a little. By mid-afternoon, the house was filled with the sounds of family chatter. My sister Margaret and her husband, Peter, were seated on the sofa, catching up with my niece and nephew. A few cousins mingled in the dining room, their laughter echoing through the space. And then there was Henry, positioned in his wheelchair by the window, his expression as calm and unreadable as ever. I couldn't help but feel a surge of anger as I watched him. He had no idea what was coming, or perhaps he did and simply believed he could talk his way out of it. Either way, his composure only fueled my resolve. After everyone had settled, I stood at the front of the living room, my hands clasped tightly in front of me. The murmurs quieted as the family turned their attention to me, curiosity and confusion etched on their faces. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice steady, despite the butterflies in my stomach. "I know this gathering might seem sudden, but there's something I need to share with you. Something I've only recently discovered." I glanced at Claire, who gave me a subtle nod of encouragement. Taking a deep breath, I continued. "For 30 years, I've cared for Henry," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I've devoted my life to his needs, believing he was paralyzed after his accident. But recently, I discovered that wasn't the truth." A ripple of confusion spread through the room, murmurs rising as the family exchanged glances. Henry stiffened in his wheelchair, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about, Elizabeth?" he asked, his tone sharp. "I'm talking about the fact that you've been lying," I said, my voice gaining strength. "I've seen you walk, Henry. I've read the emails, the financial records, the messages from Carlton. I know everything. The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging in the air like a heavy curtain. Henry's face paled, his composure faltering for the first time. "This is absurd," he said, his voice laced with desperation. "You're mistaken." "I'm not mistaken," I said firmly, holding up the receipt for the running shoes. "Explain this, Henry. Or should I share the emails? The transfers to the offshore account? The exit plan you've been discussing with Carlton?" Henry's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The family stared at him, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Is this true?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "Henry, have you been lying about your paralysis?" For a moment, it seemed as though he might deny it. But then his shoulders slumped, and he let out a long, defeated sigh. "Yes," he said quietly. "It's true." The room erupted in chaos, voices overlapping, questions flying, accusations cutting through the air like knives. Margaret looked as though she might faint, while Peter's face turned an alarming shade of red. "How could you do this?" Margaret demanded, her voice rising. "To Elizabeth? To all of us?" Henry didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the floor. I stepped forward, my hands trembling, but my voice steady. "Why, Henry?" I asked. "Why would you do this to me? To us?" He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place, regret, shame, or perhaps just exhaustion. "I didn't know how to stop," he said finally. "At first, it was about the money. The business was failing, and I needed time to figure things out. But then it became easier to keep the lie going than to admit the truth." "And the money?" Claire asked, her tone sharp. "The offshore account, the transfers, what was your plan, Henry?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I was going to leave," he admitted. "Once I had enough saved, I was going to leave and start over. I thought it would be easier for both of us." "Easier?" I repeated, my voice breaking. "You let me believe you were helpless. You let me sacrifice my life for you. And you call that easier?" "I didn't ask you to do that," he said defensively. "You chose to." His words hit me like a slap, the sheer audacity of them leaving me momentarily speechless. For 30 years, I had poured everything I had into caring for him, and now he was trying to shift the blame onto me. The family's outrage reached a fever pitch, their voices blending into a cacophony of anger and disbelief. But I tuned it all out, focusing only on Henry. For the first time in decades, I saw him clearly, not as the man I had loved, but as the man he had become. A liar. A manipulator. A man who had stolen not just my trust, but my life. "You've taken everything from me," I said quietly, my voice cutting through the noise. "But you won't take another moment." Henry looked up at me, his expression blank. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm done," I said firmly. "Done caring for you. Done sacrificing for you. Done being your victim." The family fell silent, their eyes on me as I stood tall, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. I turned to Claire, who gave me a small, encouraging smile. "You don't deserve my forgiveness, Henry," I said, my voice steady. "But you will give me my life back. And you will answer for what you've done." The days following the family gathering felt surreal. The truth was out, and the carefully constructed lie that Henry had maintained for 3 decades had crumbled. But the weight of what I had learned, what I had endured, pressed heavily on my chest. I knew the next steps wouldn't be easy, but they were necessary. For the first time in 30 years, I wasn't taking care of Henry anymore. I was taking care of myself. Henry stayed in the house, though I made it clear that things would never return to the way they had been. He had no choice but to rely on himself now, and the irony wasn't lost on me. The man who had faked his paralysis was now faced with the reality of true helplessness, or so I thought. "I'll manage," he said one morning, his tone clipped as he struggled to prepare his own breakfast. I don't need you. Good, I said calmly. Because I won't be here. I had started spending more time away from the house, taking long walks, visiting friends I hadn't seen in years, and even attending a support group for caregivers. It was in those quiet hours, away from the chaos of the past few weeks, that I began to rediscover myself. Claire remained my anchor, guiding me through the complexities of dealing with Henry's deception. Together, we contacted a lawyer to explore my options. The offshore accounts, the embezzled money, and the years of financial mismanagement weren't just moral failings, they were crimes. You have every right to pursue legal action, the lawyer said during our first meeting. What he's done goes beyond deception. He's stolen from you. The idea of taking Henry to court made my stomach churn. Despite everything, the thought of dragging our private life into a public arena felt overwhelming. But as I sat with Claire, poring over the evidence, I realized it wasn't just about me. It was about holding him accountable for the pain he had caused and ensuring he couldn't do this to anyone else. Filing the lawsuit was the first step. The process was slow, filled with paperwork and meetings, but with Claire's support, I felt more prepared than I ever thought I could be. Henry, of course, was livid. You're really going to ruin me, aren't you? He said one evening, his voice dripping with bitterness. You ruined yourself, Henry, I replied, my tone calm but firm. I'm just making sure you face the consequences. As the weeks turned into months, I began to rebuild my life piece by piece. The support group became a lifeline, a place where I could share my story without fear of judgment. Hearing others talk about their struggles with caregiving, with loss, with betrayal, made me feel less alone. I wasn't just Elizabeth, the wife who had been lied to, I was Elizabeth, a woman with strength and resilience she hadn't realized she possessed. One afternoon, as I sat in the garden, Claire joined me with a stack of papers in her hands. I've been going over the financials again, she said, handing me a folder. There's one more thing we need to discuss. I opened the folder, my eyes scanning the documents. Among them was a letter from one of the businesses Henry had worked with before his supposed accident. It was dated a month before the crash and referenced a significant loan he had taken out. He never paid this back, Claire said. And it's not the only one. He was in deep trouble long before the accident. The revelation wasn't surprising, but it added another layer to the betrayal. Henry hadn't just lied about his paralysis, he had used it as a shield to escape the consequences of his financial failures. The thought made my stomach turn. As the case against Henry progressed, the tension in the house became unbearable. He oscillated between anger and self-pity, lashing out at me one moment and pleading for forgiveness the next. You don't understand what it was like, he said one evening, his voice breaking. I was drowning, Elizabeth. I didn't know what else to do. You could have told me the truth, I said, my voice steady. You could have asked for help instead of manipulating me. He had no answer for that, his silence a stark contrast to the years of excuses and justifications I had endured. The day of the court hearing was a turning point. Claire accompanied me, her presence a source of strength as we walked into the courtroom. Henry sat across from me, his expression a mix of defiance and shame. The evidence we presented, the bank records, the emails, the testimony from Carlton, painted a damning picture of his deceit. As the judge handed down the ruling, ordering Henry to repay the stolen funds and imposing additional penalties, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. Justice had been served, and for the first time in years, I felt free. In the weeks that followed, I finalized the arrangements to sell the house. It was time to move on, to leave behind the place that had become a symbol of my sacrifices. I found a small cottage on the edge of town, surrounded by trees and flowers, where I could start fresh. On my last day in the house, I stood in the living room, taking one final look around. The memories, both good and bad, flooded my mind, but I didn't linger on them. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. As I walked out the door, I felt lighter than I had in years. I didn't know exactly what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain, it was mine to claim. If you've enjoyed my story, please leave your comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, where your support means the world to me. I look forward to bringing you more stories that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.